The letter had been hidden behind a loose hearthstone for 30 years, and the moment Ezekiel Bishop pulled it free, the entire story of his life cracked open like dry earth after the first hard rain of spring. He had arrived in Coldwater Creek, Texas, on the 14th of March, 1878, with nothing but a carpetbag, a deed to land he had never seen, and a name he was only beginning to understand might not fully belong to him. The deed had come through a lawyer in Abilene, a thin man named Horace Greer, who smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and who had slid the documents across his desk with the careful solemnity of a man delivering a coffin rather than a fortune. The letter accompanying the deed had been brief. His uncle, Robert Bishop, had died the previous November without a wife or children of his own. Ezekiel, being the last living bishop, had inherited the ranch known as the Double Cross, situated on 400 acres of good grazing land outside Coldwater Creek, along with the cattle, the outbuildings, the horses, and whatever debts remained against the property. Ezekiel had been 26 years old, working as a telegraph operator in Fort Worth, a life of clicking keys and thin coffee and rooms that smelled of other men's boots. He had never met his Uncle Robert. He had barely known his own father, Solomon Bishop, who had ridden west when Ezekiel was 4 years old and had sent a handful of letters over the years before the letters stopped coming entirely. His mother, a quiet woman from Georgia, had raised him alone until she passed of fever when he was 17. The Bishop name had always felt like a coat he wore but had not chosen, something inherited without warmth. So when the deed arrived, he packed his bag and bought a ticket west. Coldwater Creek was the kind of town that announced itself with dust before it announced itself with buildings. The main street ran straight and unpretentious, lined with a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Dusty Boot, a small church painted white that was already peeling, and a land office that doubled as the sheriff's station. The people who watched him ride in off the stage were not unfriendly, but they were careful in the way that people in small towns are always careful about strangers. They took the measure of him quietly, from under hat brims and through wavy glass windows. He had a lean, weathered look despite his years behind a desk, tall and dark-haired with eyes the color of river water on a cloudy day, and there was something in the set of his jaw that reminded the older residents of Robert Bishop, though most of them kept that observation to themselves. He went to the livery first, hired a horse, and rode out to see his land. The Double Cross Ranch sat at the foot of a long, grassy rise, a main house of rough limestone and cedar, solid and square and weather-beaten but sound. There were 2 outbuildings, a barn, a corral holding 8 horses, and a small herd of mixed cattle numbering perhaps 60 head, and beyond it all, the long roll of the Texas plains under a sky so enormous it made every human problem feel briefly and mercifully small. He stood in the yard for a long time before he went inside. The inside of the house was dusty but not abandoned. Someone had been keeping the place, not out of love exactly, but out of duty. The hearth in the main room was swept. The wooden floors had been recently mopped, the smell of lye soap still faint in the air. In the kitchen there were dried beans and salt pork on the shelves, a tin of coffee, a cast-iron skillet hanging from a hook. He did not know it yet, but the person responsible for that quiet, dutiful order was Bessie Ellsworth. He met her the next morning. She arrived at the front of the ranch house just after sunrise, driving a small wagon pulled by a piebald mare, her dark red hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better weather, wearing a faded blue dress under a canvas work apron. She was 23 years old, and she moved with the particular efficiency of a woman who had learned early that no one else was going to do the work for her. She pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at him standing on the porch with his coffee cup, and she did not seem the least bit surprised to find him there. "You must be the new owner," she said, climbing down without waiting for help. She tied the mare to the post and pulled a basket of food from the back of the wagon with practiced ease. "Ezekiel Bishop," he said. She looked up at him then, directly, and without the shyness some women affected as a social courtesy. Her eyes were the color of dark honey, and there was a steadiness in them that he had not expected and could not quite look away from. "Bessie Ellsworth," she said, "I have been keeping this house since your uncle passed. I cook, I clean, and I manage the household accounts. I was not sure if you would be keeping me on or not, so I thought I would come and let you decide directly rather than waiting on a letter." He blinked. He had not given a single thought to how the house had been maintained, not until that moment. "You have my gratitude," he said. "And yes, I would be very glad of your help. I know cattle law and I know telegraph wire, but I cannot say I know much about running a household." Something softened at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile but close to it. "Then we will manage," she said, and she walked past him and into the house with the calm authority of someone who had managed things before and expected to manage them again. He learned over the following days that Bessie Ellsworth was the daughter of a farmer named George Ellsworth, who had homesteaded land 6 miles east of the Double Cross before a bad string of winters, and a bank debt had taken the farm out from under him. George Ellsworth had died the previous spring, leaving Bessie with a small sum of money, a horse, and no land of her own. She had been doing domestic work for 3 households in the area, the Double Cross being one of them, supplementing that with taking in mending and selling eggs from the 6 hens she kept in a coop behind the modest room she rented above the Coldwater Creek general store. She was independent in the way that poverty and necessity produced independence, not because it was fashionable, but because she had no alternative. She was also deeply, quietly proud, the kind of pride that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with self-respect. Ezekiel found himself watching her more than he should have in those first days. The way she moved through the kitchen, as if she and the cast iron and the wood stove had reached some private understanding. The way she assessed the livestock with calm, intelligent eyes, and told him matter-of-factly that he had 2 cows close to calving, and a fence line on the eastern pasture that needed mending before the spring rains turned the ground soft. The way she poured his coffee in the morning and set it down without ceremony, without fuss, as though this small act of care was simply part of the contract of human beings sharing a space. He hired 3 ranch hands in that first week, men recommended by the livery owner, a quiet Texan named Dale who knew cattle like he had been born among them, a younger man named Clyde who was eager to the point of occasional recklessness, and an older wrangler named Ben who had the slow, careful competence of a man who had learned every mistake the hard way and was no longer interested in repeating them. The work of the ranch absorbed him. He was not by nature a passive man, and the physical labor of the land, the riding and the fencing and the learning of the cattle and the slow education of what it meant to steward a piece of ground, filled something in him that the clicking of telegraph keys had never reached. He rose before dawn and worked until the light failed, and at the end of those long days he sat at the kitchen table while Bessie set supper on, and he told her about what he had done, and what he had found, and what he did not yet understand. And she listened, and sometimes corrected him, and sometimes told him things about the land itself that Robert Bishop had apparently taught her. Observations about water tables and grazing patterns and the behavior of cattle in heat and cold that were practical and precise and irreplaceable. They fell into a rhythm without meaning to. A rhythm that felt, to Ezekiel, dangerously close to something he was not ready to name. It was on the 18th day after his arrival that he found the letter. He had been meaning to repair the hearthstone in the main room since his first week. One of the large flat stones that formed the base of the fireplace had worked loose and rocked underfoot in a way that made the whole thing feel unstable. He had finally gotten to it on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while Bessie was in town getting supplies, prying the stone up with a flat-ended iron bar. Beneath it, in a small oilcloth package wrapped with twine, was a letter. The oilcloth was thick and well sealed, and the letter inside was in fine condition, the paper yellowed but legible, written in a hand he did not recognize, addressed to no one. He sat down on the hearthrug and read it. The letter was dated September 12, 1848. 30 years passed, and it was written by a man named Thomas Harlan Bishop, who Ezekiel eventually understood was his grandfather. It was addressed to Robert Bishop and to Solomon Bishop, the two sons of Thomas Harlan Bishop. It was a long letter, careful and deliberate, the kind of letter a man writes when he knows he is dying and wants to set the record straight before he goes. The substance of it changed everything. Thomas Harlan Bishop had not been born a bishop. He had been born Thomas Harlan, the second son of a cotton farmer in South Carolina, and had come west in his early 20s with nothing but a strong back and the ambition common to young men who have no inheritance to wait for. He had taken the name Bishop somewhere in the crossing, a practical reinvention that was not uncommon on the frontier, where a man could shed a name and a past with roughly equal ease. The name Bishop had been the name of a man who had saved his life during a river crossing and who had died of fever the following winter, and Thomas had taken it as a kind of tribute, or perhaps as a kind of appropriation, and the distinction was something the letter did not fully resolve. But that was not the most significant thing the letter contained. The most significant thing was the account of what Thomas Harlan Bishop had done in the winter of 1843. He had been working cattle with a man named Edward Caswell, a man who had what Thomas described as a legitimate land grant on 2,000 acres along Coldwater Creek. Edward Caswell had died suddenly of a heart episode that same winter, leaving behind a wife and a young son, and the 2,000 acres. Thomas, who had no land and who had been working Caswell's cattle for wages, had filed a claim on a portion of that land, 500 acres including what would eventually become the Double Cross, using documents he had helped Edward Caswell draft, documents he had quietly altered after Caswell's death to make the transfer of ownership appear legitimate. Edward Caswell's son, the letter stated, had been 7 years old in 1843. His name had been William Caswell. And he had been, as far as Thomas knew at the time of writing the letter, alive somewhere in Texas. The Bishop name and the Bishop land had both been taken from another family. Ezekiel sat on the hearthrug for a very long time. When Bessie returned from town in the late afternoon, she found him sitting at the kitchen table with the letter open in front of him and his coffee growing cold. She set down her basket and looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her pull out a chair and sit down without being asked. "What has happened?" she said. He slid the letter across the table. He watched her face as she read it. Bessie was not a woman who performed emotion for an audience, and the expressions that moved across her face as she read were real and unguarded, first confusion, then growing attention, then the careful, still look of someone processing something morally serious. She set the letter down. "William Caswell," she said. "Do you know that name?" She was quiet for a moment. "There is a William Caswell in Coldwater Creek," she said. "He is 62 years old. He runs the land office." The land office that doubled as the sheriff's station. Ezekiel had been in that building twice already on business related to the deed and the cattle registry. He closed his eyes briefly. "He never knew," he said. It was not a question. "I do not think so," Bessie said. "He has always had the reputation of a straightforward, decent man. If he had known about this, there would have been a legal fight years ago." Ezekiel stood up. He picked up the letter and folded it with great care and put it in his breast pocket, close to his heart, which seemed somehow right, since the weight of it was a heart weight, the weight of what a man does when he discovers that the floor under everything he thought he owned is hollow ground. "I have to speak to him," Ezekiel said. Bessie stood as well. "I know," she said. She did not try to talk him out of it. She did not suggest that the letter was old enough to be buried again, that no one would know, that the legal complexity of a 30-year-old fraud was perhaps beyond remedy. She simply met his eyes and said, "I know," in the quiet, firm way she had, and somehow that two-word acknowledgement of the hardest thing he had ever faced made it easier to face. He rode to Coldwater Creek before supper. William Caswell was still in the land office when Ezekiel arrived. He was a large man, thick through the chest and shoulders in the way that hard-worked men go thick as they age, with white hair and a white beard kept neat, and a pair of spectacles pushed up on his forehead in the universal gesture of a man who has been reading for hours. He looked up when Ezekiel came in, recognized him as the new owner of the Double Cross, and gave him the polite, measured nod of a man who runs a public office. Ezekiel closed the door behind him. He put the letter on the desk. He said, "I found this hidden under the hearthstone of the Double Cross house. I believe it concerns your family, Mr. Caswell, and I believe you have a right to read it before anyone else in this town does." Caswell looked at him for a long, searching moment. Then he picked up the letter and unfolded it and read it, and Ezekiel stood by the window and looked out at the main street of Coldwater Creek in the last light of the day and waited. The silence in that room was one of the longest silences of his life. When Caswell finished reading, he set the letter down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, though of course the paper was not what was fragile. He took off his spectacles and set those down too, and he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, and when he looked up his face was the face of a man who has just received a blow he was not braced for but is not going to fall down from. "Your grandfather," Caswell said. "My grandfather," Ezekiel confirmed. "By name if not by blood, and I am not certain even of that now." Caswell looked at the letter again. "You could have buried this," he said. "Put the stone back. No one would have been the wiser." "I know. Why didn't you?" Ezekiel thought about Bessie's eyes when she read it, the quiet certainty in them that there was only one thing a man of conscience could do. He thought about his Uncle Robert, who had hidden the letter rather than destroyed it, which suggested Robert had known and had carried it as a burden rather than an action, and whether that was cowardice or paralysis or simply the terrible weight of being complicit in someone else's sin without having committed it yourself. He thought about his grandfather Thomas, who had written the letter at all, as if confession, even a private one sealed under a stone, was something the soul demanded. "Because it is your land," Ezekiel said, "or it was meant to be, and that does not go away because 30 years passed." Caswell was quiet for another long stretch. He was not a man who spoke before he was ready, and Ezekiel respected that. "What do you propose?" Caswell said finally. "I would like to make it right," Ezekiel said. "I do not know exactly how the law sits on a matter this old. I would like to speak to a lawyer and understand what is possible. But I want to be clear, I am not here to negotiate. I am here because it is the right thing to do, and I want to work with you toward whatever resolution is fair." Caswell studied him for a long moment with those pale, steady eyes. "Your uncle knew," he said. "It was not a question either." "I believe so," Ezekiel said. "He never came to me." "No. I think that is something he will have to answer for in a place I cannot speak about. I can only answer for what I do now that I know." Something shifted in William Caswell's expression. It did not become warm, not yet, because the wound was too fresh and too deep for warmth. But it became something like respect, careful and provisory but real. "Come back Friday," Caswell said. "I will have spoken to the circuit lawyer by then. We will work out what can be done." Ezekiel rode back to the Double Cross in the dark, the Texas stars enormous above him, and the night air carrying the smell of dry grass and cedar, and something that might have been rain coming in from the northwest. Bessie was still in the kitchen. She had left the lamp burning, and there was cornbread and beans keeping warm on the back of the stove, and she was sitting at the table with a piece of mending in her lap, her head bent over the work in the lamplight. She looked up when he came in, and the question in her eyes was very quiet. "He knows," Ezekiel said. "We will talk to a lawyer Friday." She nodded. She set down the mending and got up and poured him coffee and set the food on the table without a word, and he sat down and ate. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable but full, the way a room fills with warmth when a fire is going well, not needing to be remarked upon. The legal matter took 3 weeks to resolve, and it was not simple, but it was resolved. The circuit lawyer, A methodical man named Arthur Hale, who had seen stranger cases in his years on the Texas frontier, confirmed that the original land grant under Edward Caswell's name was still on record at the county seat. The documents Robert Bishop had filed in the 1840s had not replaced that record but had been layered over it, and with the letter as evidence and Ezekiel's full cooperation, the title to the 500 acres that formed the Double Cross was legally restored to William Caswell. This left Ezekiel with the cattle, the horses, the equipment, and no land. He did not regret it. That was the thing that surprised him most. He had done the right thing and lost the inheritance he had traveled across Texas to claim, and he felt something that was not quite peace but was adjacent to it, the particular lightness of a man who has set down something heavy enough to have been crushing him without his being aware of the weight. He was sitting on the porch of the ranch house on the evening after the papers were signed, not yet sure exactly what came next, when Bessie came out and sat beside him in the other chair. They sat for a while without speaking, watching the sunset do extraordinary things to the sky over the western plain. "What will you do?" she said. "I have not entirely decided," he said. "I have the cattle and the horses. I need land to run them on." He paused. "I have some money saved from my years in Fort Worth, not a great deal but something." "There is a homestead parcel north of here that came open last month," Bessie said. 160 acres. The soil is not as rich as the Double Cross, but the water is good and the grass is reliable." He looked at her. "You have been paying attention." "I always pay attention," she said simply. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that started in the chest before it reached the face. "Bessie," he said, "I'm not certain I know exactly what I am doing out here with the land or the cattle or any of it, but I know that these past weeks, the things I have managed to figure out have mostly been because of you." She met his gaze, and there was something complicated in hers, something careful, as if she had learned to be careful about the things that mattered most. "I do not want flattery, Ezekiel Bishop," she said, but her voice was not unkind. "It is not flattery," he said. "It is the truth, and I am trying to be better about telling the truth, given recent events." That made her laugh. A short, warm, genuine laugh that he had not heard from her before and found he very much wanted to hear again. The days that followed had a different quality to them. Something had shifted between them, not anything said aloud and certainly nothing acted upon, but a change in the quality of the air between them, something warmer and more aware. Ezekiel filed the homestead claim on the 160 acres Bessie had mentioned, paid the filing fee with careful attention to his remaining savings, and began the work of building something from the beginning on land that was genuinely, cleanly his. William Caswell, for his part, turned out to be a man whose sense of justice was matched only by his practical sense. He came to Ezekiel a week after the legal transfer and offered him a working arrangement, that Ezekiel could run his cattle on the Double Cross land in exchange for a portion of the proceeds of the herd, while Ezekiel built up his own operation on the homestead. It was a fair arrangement, and it was more than Ezekiel had any right to expect, and he accepted it with genuine gratitude and told Caswell so directly. "Do not thank me," Caswell said, not unkindly. "Your grandfather wronged my father. You righted it. That is a debt settled, and what I offer now is simple partnership, nothing more complicated than that." Ezekiel appreciated the clarity of it. There was something very Texan about settling things plainly and moving forward. He spent his days between the homestead, where he was building the frame of a proper house with the help of Dale and Ben, and the Double Cross Range, where the cattle work continued. Bessie was no longer employed to keep the Double Cross house, since William Caswell's grown daughter had moved in to take over the household, and so the arrangement with Bessie had changed technically. Though in practice, Bessie continued to come out to the homestead building site with food at midday, and on occasion rode with Ezekiel to check the cattle and give her opinions on the state of the herd, with the same unassuming authority she brought to everything. One afternoon in late April, when the wildflowers were doing extravagant things across the Texas plain, and the air had the clear, golden quality of a day that was trying to be perfect. They rode the fence line of the homestead together, and Ezekiel told her things he had not told anyone. He told her about his mother and about Fort Worth, and about the particular loneliness of a man who has a name without a history, who knows he belongs somewhere but cannot figure out where that somewhere is. He told her about the telegraph keys and the messages he had sent for other people, love letters and business notices and announcements of death, and how that had felt after a while, like handling other people's lives without touching his own. Bessie listened in the way she always listened, completely, without the fidgeting restlessness that listening required of people who were only waiting for their turn to speak. "Did you not have someone," she said when he paused, "in Fort Worth, someone who mattered?" "There was a woman," he said honestly, "for a time, but she wanted someone whose life was already built, and I was still too much of an unfinished thing for her." "What happened to her?" "She married the owner of a dry goods concern," he said. "She seemed genuinely happy about it. I hope she is." Bessie was quiet for a moment. "And you?" "I was sadder about the idea of it than the fact of it," he said, which told me something. He looked at her. The sun was behind her and she had her hat in her hand for a moment, her dark red hair catching the light, and the sight of her hit him somewhere under the sternum in a way that was entirely distinct from anything he had felt in Fort Worth. "What about you?" he said. She looked out over the plain. "I was engaged once," she said, "to a man named Peter Walsh who farmed near my father's land. He was a decent man. But he went east to see a sick brother and met a woman there and wrote me a letter about it, which I thought was at least more honest than some men would have managed. She said it without bitterness, but there was something wry and a little weary in it. After that it was mostly work," she said, "and that has suited me well enough." "Has it?" he said. She turned to look at him, and there it was again, that steadiness in her eyes, that particular quality of attention that made him feel, every single time, as if he was being seen fully and clearly and without convenient omissions. "Mostly," she said, and there was something in that word, in the small modification of her original claim, that made his heart do something it had not done in a considerable time. He did not say anything else then. He was a man who had recently learned the cost of acting too quickly on things that required careful handling, and this was the thing he was most careful with. But the next Sunday, when the whole of Coldwater Creek dressed in its best and went to the white peeling church, he sat next to Bessie, and people noticed, and he did not mind that they noticed, and he thought from the slight warmth in her color that she did not entirely mind it either. The house on the homestead was framed by the end of May. It was a modest structure, one main room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, built with good Texas limestone where he could get it and cedar timber where he could not. Ben turned out to be remarkable with a hammer, having spent his early years in carpentry before cattle called him away, and the house went up straight and solid, and with a kind of simple dignity that Ezekiel found deeply satisfying. Bessie came to look at it on the day the roof went on. She walked through the empty room slowly, running her hand along the kitchen wall where the open shelving would go, standing in the doorway of the main room and looking at the fireplace Ezekiel had built himself from flat stones gathered off the creek bed. "It is a good house," she said. "It needs a great deal still," he said. "Furniture, curtains, a kitchen garden." "Yes," she said. "I was thinking," he said, and then he stopped, because he had been thinking about this for weeks, and now that the moment had arrived, he found himself unexpectedly uncertain of exactly how to proceed, which was unusual for him. He was generally a straightforward man. She looked at him with that clear, direct regard of hers, and there was something in her expression that was different from its usual careful neutrality, something softer, something that had been building for weeks like water rising in a cistern, patient and inevitable. "Ezekiel," she said quietly. "I am trying to say something," he said. "I know," she said. "You have been trying for 3 weeks. I have been watching you try." He looked at her, caught between amusement and embarrassment, and she smiled, a full, real smile that he had not seen from her before in all these weeks. Not the almost smile or the wry curve of the mouth, but an actual, unguarded smile that changed her whole face, and something in his chest simply gave way. "I would like you to live in this house," he said, "with me, as my wife Bessie, if you will have me. I know I am a man without the land I arrived with, and what I have is what I have built in the last 3 months, which is not a great deal in material terms. But I believe I am a man you can trust, and I believe that between us we could make this into something real and good. And I believe, though I am aware this is presumptuous, that the last 3 months have been the best of my life, and that has everything to do with you." There was a silence that lasted approximately 3 beats of his heart. "It is not presumptuous," Bessie said. "It is the truth, and you know how I feel about the truth." And then she stepped forward and put her hand against his jaw, that practical hand that had mended curtains and managed accounts and gentled horses and poured 10,000 cups of coffee, and she said, "Yes, yes, Ezekiel, I will marry you." He brought his hand up over hers and held it there against his face for a moment, and then he turned his head and pressed his lips against her palm, and she made a small sound that was not quite a word, and he thought, with the absolute clarity that sometimes comes at moments of genuine rightness, that he had found what he was looking for, not the land or the cattle or even the name, but this woman and this plane and this life that they were going to build together, starting from the truth instead of a lie. They were married on the 15th of June, 1878, in the white peeling church in Coldwater Creek. The day was clear and hot and brilliant, the sky a shade of blue that seemed too saturated to be real, and the whole town came out because Coldwater Creek was the kind of place where weddings were civic events as much as personal ones. Bessie wore a dress she had made herself from a bolt of cream-colored cotton she had bought at the general store, with small blue flowers embroidered along the collar in a pattern she had designed from memory of a dress her mother had worn in an old daguerreotype. It was not a fine dress by the standards of the eastern cities, but it was beautiful in the way that things made with care and skill and love are beautiful, which is the truest kind. Ezekiel wore his best clothes, which were not particularly fine either, and he did not care in the slightest because when Bessie came through the church door on the arm of William Caswell, who had offered to stand in for her father, and he saw her walking toward him down that short aisle with those wildflower arrangements in glass jars on the pew ends, and the Texas sun coming through the windows in long, dusty planks of light, everything unnecessary fell away, and all that remained was the simple, staggering fact of her. The preacher was a young man named Reverend Ford who took the ceremony seriously and kept it brief, which Ezekiel appreciated, and when they said their vows they said them to each other directly, looking at each other, and there was nothing performed about it. When he kissed her for the first time in front of God in Coldwater Creek, her hands came up and held his lapels lightly, and the whole church made the particular sound that congregations make when something has gone exactly as it should. The supper afterward was held in the yard behind the church, tables set up with food brought by half the town, and there was a fiddle player and a man with a squeeze box, and the dancing went on until the stars came out, and Ezekiel danced with his wife twice and watched her dance with Dale and with old Ben, and with William Caswell's serious-faced grandson, and every time she came back to him, she looked more alive than she had before, which did not seem possible but was plainly true. They rode home to the homestead in the warm dark, the horses knowing the road well enough that neither of them needed to pay much attention, and they rode close together with their hands touching on the saddle horn, not speaking much, and the silence was the best kind of silence, the silence of people who are exactly where they belong. The first year of their marriage was not easy, because the first year of anything built from the ground up is not easy. The cattle work was hard and the summer was hot, and there was a stretch in August where the creek ran low, and the grass on the eastern pasture burned brown, and Ezekiel worried about water in a way he had not expected to. Bessie put in a kitchen garden that produced abundantly despite the heat, cucumbers and beans and squash and dried herbs hanging from the kitchen rafters in neat bundles, and she took on the bookkeeping for the ranch operation with the same precise, unfussy competence she brought to everything, and her accounts were always accurate, and her assessments always honest even when they were not what he wanted to hear. He learned from her constantly. He learned about the land in the particular, intimate way that she had absorbed it from her years in the area, which creeks ran true in the dry months, and which ones were seasonal liars, which sellers at the Coldwater Creek market were honest, and which required careful attention, how to read the clouds above the western plain for the kind of weather that came fast and mean off the upper range. And she learned from him. She had never had anyone who read to her in the evenings, and he had brought his small collection of books from Fort Worth, philosophy and history, and a handful of novels. And after supper, when the oil lamp was going, he sometimes read aloud while she mended or tallied accounts, and she listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything. And sometimes she stopped him to ask about something, and the discussion that followed was the best kind. Two minds working at a question from different directions, and meeting somewhere in the middle. They disagreed because they were two strong-willed people with their own views about cattle prices and household decisions, and once in September about whether to sell 20 head in Abilene or wait for the better price of November. Bessie was right about that one, and he told her so straightforwardly, which made her look at him with something that was equal parts surprise and pleasure. "I'm not accustomed to men who say they were wrong and mean it," she said. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I will try to be less wrong next time." "That is really all you can do," she said, and she was laughing when she said it, and he pulled her close and kissed her temple and held her for a moment in the kitchen doorway with the October light coming in amber and the smell of her hair filling everything good about the world. That winter was a good one, cold and clear, and not the killing cold that could devastate a herd. The cattle did well, and the house was warm, and they were enough for each other in the particular way of people who have both known loneliness and know, therefore, what the alternative is worth. William Caswell came out to supper once a month or so, and over those suppers something that had begun as obligation and cautious respect had grown into genuine friendship. Caswell was a man with a great deal of history stored behind those steady pale eyes, and when he talked about the early years of Coldwater Creek, the building of it, the people who had come, and the people who had gone, and the various ways the frontier shaped human beings, Ezekiel listened with total attention, because this was the history that his grandfather had entered sideways and dishonestly, and that he was determined to be part of honestly. Caswell never brought up the past injustice again. It had been addressed, it had been resolved, and Caswell was not a man who dwelt on what had been set right. But once, late in the evening after a long supper and a great deal of coffee, he looked at Ezekiel across the table and said, "Your grandfather was a flawed man, Bishop, but he wrote the letter, that is something." "He hid it under a stone for 30 years, Ezekiel said. "He wrote it," Caswell said. "Some men do not even get that far." Ezekiel thought about that for a long time. In February of 1879, Bessie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, with the same directness she brought to everything, watching his face as she said it. He stared at her for a full moment, and then he stood up from the table and crossed to her and held her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression that she described later as completely undone in the best possible way. "Are you well?" he managed. "Perfectly well," she said, smiling. "Tired in the mornings and not terribly interested in salt pork, but otherwise perfectly well." He kissed her forehead and her cheeks and then her mouth and then her forehead again, and she laughed and put her hands on his chest and said, "Ezekiel, I am not made of glass." "No," he agreed. "You are made of something considerably stronger than glass. But you will forgive me if I am beside myself for a few minutes." "A few minutes," she allowed. He was, in fact, beside himself for considerably longer than a few minutes. He spent the rest of that day in a state of barely contained joy that expressed itself as an unusual level of efficiency in his work, All 4 fence posts he had been meaning to replace getting replaced, and the barn getting a repair it had been needing for a month, which Dale observed with raised eyebrows and said nothing about. The spring came in on schedule, green and extravagant, and with it came the need to expand. Ezekiel went to talk to William Caswell about the possibility of purchasing a portion of the Double Cross acreage now that his own operation was stable and growing. Caswell listened, and then offered something Ezekiel had not anticipated: that Caswell's daughter and son-in-law, who had been running the Double Cross Ranch, were planning to move to San Antonio for her health, and that Caswell, at 62, was not inclined to run 400 acres himself. He proposed to sell Ezekiel half the Double Cross acreage, 200 acres of the best grazing land along the creek, at a fair market price payable over 5 years. Ezekiel came home that evening with the provisional agreement in his breast pocket and sat down across from Bessie and spread the terms on the table and told her what Caswell had proposed. She studied the terms in silence, her pencil moving as she worked through the numbers. Her lower lip caught lightly between her teeth in the way it always did when she was calculating. "It is a good price," she said, "and the creekside pasture is the best grass in the valley." She looked up. "Can we manage it?" "I believe we can," he said, "but I wanted you to tell me if you think I am wrong." She looked at the numbers again for a long moment. "We can manage it," she said, "if we sell the November cattle in Abilene as planned and do not take on any significant new debt beyond this purchase." "Agreed," he said. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, do it." They shook hands across the table, which made them both laugh, and then he came around the table and pulled her gently to her feet and danced her slowly around the kitchen without any music at all, her head against his chest and the spring evening coming in through the window, and she said into his shirt, "This is a ridiculous thing to be doing." "I know," he said happily. The summer of 1879 was the hardest and the best of what they had built so far. The expansion of the ranch was complicated. The cattle work was constant. The homestead required continuous attention, and Bessie was in the later months of her pregnancy, which she navigated with her characteristic refusal to make more of her discomfort than was necessary while also being sensible about what she could and could not do. He worried about her constantly and tried not to let the worrying become something she had to manage on top of everything else. There was a doctor in Coldwater Creek now, a recent arrival named Dr. Marcus Webb, who was young and competent and had trained in St. Louis, and Bessie saw him regularly and reported his assessments to Ezekiel with scientific precision, which he appreciated even when the underlying thing he was feeling was something considerably less rational than appreciation. "You hover," Bessie told him one evening in July, not unkindly. "I am aware of that," he said. "I am going to be fine," she said. "I know you are going to be fine," he said. "I simply prefer to confirm it regularly." She put her hand over his where it rested on her growing abdomen and turned to look at him in the lamplight. "I have been taking care of myself for a long time, Ezekiel," she said. "This is just something more important than usual to take care of." "I know," he said, "but you do not have to do it alone anymore." There was a pause. "I know that," she said quietly, and the way she said it told him that knowing it was still, sometimes, something she was adjusting to, that the habit of solitude and self-reliance did not dissolve entirely just because the circumstances had changed, and that there was work being done in her that was not the physical work but the internal work of letting herself be cared for, and he loved her for it, for the effort of it, as much as he loved her for anything. Their son was born on the 22nd of September, 1879, just as the summer heat was beginning its long retreat, and the first cool edge came into the evening air off the plain. He was a healthy, loud, emphatic baby boy with dark hair and honey-colored eyes, and Ezekiel held him in the kitchen while the doctor cleaned up and Bessie rested, and he stood at the window and looked out at the plains in the early morning light and felt something so large and simple it had no particular name. He came to Bessie and put the baby carefully beside her, and she looked down at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something completely open, all the careful practical efficiency set aside for once, just love, uncomplicated and enormous. "What shall we call him?" Ezekiel said. Bessie was quiet for a moment, her finger in the baby's tight fist. "Thomas," she said, "for your grandfather." He looked at her. "After what he did, after what he wrote," she said. "The letter." "He wrote it," you said. Caswell thought that was something. He thought about it, the name Thomas. A flawed man who had written a letter of confession and hidden it under a stone where someone might find it someday. The beginning of a reckoning that had taken 30 years to complete. "Thomas Ezekiel Bishop," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is right." William Caswell came the next day to meet the baby, and when Ezekiel told him the name, something moved across that weathered old face that was quiet and complex and eventually settled into a slight nod. He held the baby for a few minutes with the careful competence of a man who had held grandchildren, and then he gave him back and stood up and shook Ezekiel's hand. "You are a good man, Bishop," he said. "I am trying to be," Ezekiel said. "That is all any of us can say," Caswell said, and meant it as a compliment, which it was. The following years on the Double Cross Range, as the ranch came to be called once more, this time legitimately and by earned right rather than stolen title, were years of genuine building. Ezekiel bought the rest of Caswell's acreage when William Caswell died peacefully in the spring of 1882, leaving it to Ezekiel in his will with a brief, direct note that said simply, "You earned this honestly, which is more than it was originally acquired, and makes it worth more accordingly." Bessie wept when she read the note, which was one of only a handful of times Ezekiel saw her cry, and he sat beside her and held her hand and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already contain. The ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not overnight, but with the steady, accumulating progress of people who work hard and make sound decisions and do not overreach. They expanded the herd, hired 2 more hands, and in 1883 added a second story to the house with a large room at the top that caught the western light in the afternoons, and which Bessie used as a sewing and reading room, and which had a view of the plains that was, in Ezekiel's opinion, the finest view in Coldwater Creek County. They had 2 more children. A second son named George, for Bessie's father, born in 1881, a solid, happy baby who grew into a cheerful, relentlessly curious child who could not pass a mechanical object without dismantling it. And then a daughter, their last child, born in 1883, who Bessie named Clara after her own mother, a name she had been saving. Thomas grew up with his father's serious eyes and his mother's practical intelligence, and by the time he was old enough to help with the cattle work he was doing it with a competence that made old Ben, who was slowing down now but still on the ranch, shake his head in quiet admiration. Coldwater Creek itself changed in those years, as all frontier towns changed in the 1880s, growing from a raw, provisional settlement into something more established and layered. A proper school opened in 1880, one that Bessie supported actively and vocally, having opinions about education that she was not shy about expressing. A second doctor arrived, giving Dr. Webb a colleague. The railroad reached a town 20 miles east, which changed the economics of cattle driving in ways that took some adjustment, but that ultimately benefited the larger operations like the Bishop Ranch. The injustice of what had been done to the Caswell family was something Coldwater Creek eventually came to know about, in the quiet, thorough way that small communities absorb information over time. The general consensus was what it generally is in such cases: admiration for the man who had made it right, measured judgment of the man who had done the original wrong, and the particular satisfaction of a story in which someone had done the difficult and correct thing rather than the easy and dishonest one. Ezekiel was occasionally asked about it over the years by new arrivals who had heard the story and wanted to understand it, and he always answered in the same way. that he had found a letter and done what the letter demanded of him, and that the land he farmed was cleaner for it, and that he slept better than he might have otherwise. Bessie said, on one of the evenings when they had talked about it, that she thought the reason the story had stuck was not because it was uncommon for someone to inherit something wrong, but because it was uncommon for someone to do what Ezekiel had done once they found out. The frontier attracted men who wanted to remake themselves, she said. They were sitting on the porch in the long summer evening of 1884, the children asleep inside, the plains going orange and violet in the last of the light. Some of them remade themselves well. Some of them carried the old wrongs with them into the new life. What you did was different. What did I do? He said, genuinely curious about her version of the story, having lived inside it himself. You chose the name honestly, she said. After finding out what it had cost to acquire it, you could have put the stone back. Instead, you decided that the Bishop name was going to mean something different going forward. That is not nothing. He looked at her in the fading light. 29 years old when he had ridden into Coldwater Creek, and he was 32 now, and she was 29, and there was so much life ahead of them and so much already behind them that had been built from the ground up, stone by stone, season by season, truth by truth. I had help, he said. She made a dismissive sound. I poured your coffee. You told me the truth, and you helped me think clearly, and you sat with me through the worst of it, and you made a home out of a shell of a house, and you are raising 3 remarkable children and running accounts that have never once been wrong, he said. I think that constitutes somewhat more than pouring coffee. She was quiet for a moment. You are going to make me cry again, she said, in a tone that implied this was an unreasonable imposition. Would that be so terrible? I have a reputation to maintain, she said. He reached over and took her hand on the armrest between their chairs, and she turned her hand and laced her fingers through his, and they sat together in the cooling evening while the first stars began to show themselves above the plain, and he thought about all the ways a life could have gone, all the roads that he had not taken, all the versions of himself that had not found this woman on this porch at the end of this long particular day. He was grateful. He was simply, thoroughly, irreversibly grateful. The year 1885 brought a dry summer, the driest in memory according to Ben, who had been in the area for 2 decades and whose memory was reliable. The grass on the upper pastures went brown by July, and 3 ranchers in the county lost cattle to the heat and the lack of water, and there was a stretch of 6 weeks in August and September when the sky was a hard, relentless blue without a cloud in it, and the air smelled of dust and dried grass, and the particular anxiety of people watching something they love becoming vulnerable. Ezekiel and Bessie talked about the herd every evening during those weeks, quiet, serious conversations at the kitchen table with Bessie's account ledgers open, and the lamp burning and the children in bed, working through what they could sell, what they needed to hold, how to husband the water they had in their creekside pastures for the cattle that mattered most. It was during this stretch that Clyde, the youngest of the ranch hands who had been with the Bishop operation since the beginning, came to Ezekiel with a business proposition from a man he called Mr. Reardon. Reardon was a cattle buyer from Abilene who was apparently offering to purchase a substantial portion of the Bishop herd at an above-market price, with the condition that the transaction be handled privately and quickly, without going through the usual market process. Ezekiel heard Clyde out and then sat with the proposal for a day before bringing it to Bessie. Bessie's response was immediate and unflinching. "Something is wrong with that," she said. "The price is good," Ezekiel said, not arguing, just laying out the facts. "The price is too good for a private buyer in a drought year," Bessie said. "The man who benefits from above-market prices in a drought is not doing it from generosity. What does he want with the cattle that he cannot get through normal channels?" Ezekiel had the same unease, though he had not articulated it as cleanly as she had. He made inquiries through a contact in Abilene, a fellow he had known in his telegraph days, and the response that came back 2 days later confirmed that Reardon was known in Abilene as a man who dealt in cattle of unclear provenance, buying from rustlers at low prices and selling on at higher ones, using private transactions to avoid the kind of scrutiny that normal market channels would have provided. He told Clyde that the Bishop Ranch was not interested. Clyde, who turned out to have known somewhat more about Reardon's activities than he had let on, decided at that point that his employment on the Bishop Ranch had run its course, which solved one problem while also confirming the wisdom of the decision. Ezekiel and Bessie hired a replacement hand, a young man named Roberto Flores, the son of a Mexican family who had been ranching in the area since before the town of Coldwater Creek had existed, a quiet and highly skilled horseman who became one of the best additions to the ranch they had ever made. The drought broke in October. The rains came in across the plain, and the creek ran clear and full, and the grass came back and the cattle recovered, and the long anxiety of that summer resolved into the particular relief of people who have survived something difficult without losing what mattered most. Bessie made a large supper that first evening after the rains, a true celebration supper with every good thing she could produce from the kitchen, and the whole household ate together at the big table, including Dale and Ben and Roberto, and there was laughter and the children were allowed to stay up late. And Ezekiel looked around that table at the faces of the people he had built this life with, and the feeling that moved through him was something he could not have put into words at 26. When he had ridden into Coldwater Creek with his carpetbag and his uncertainty and his inherited, complicated name, he understood it now. This was what home felt like, not a place so much as a web of people and shared labor and hard decisions made together, and honesty maintained even when it was costly. And at the center of it, the particular gravity of one woman who had seen him clearly from the beginning and had chosen him anyway and had been choosing him every day since. He caught Bessie's eye across the table, and she raised her coffee cup slightly in a small private toast, and he returned it, and she smiled that full, unguarded smile that had undone him in the doorway of the new house in the spring of 1878, the one that was still, after 7 years, capable of doing exactly the same thing. In 1886, the school in Coldwater Creek expanded, and Bessie was elected to the newly formed school board, the first woman to serve in that capacity, which prompted an interesting degree of local commentary that she acknowledged, and then roundly ignored in the way she ignored anything that tried to limit what she was capable of doing. She brought the same practical efficiency to the school board that she brought to everything else, and within a year the school had a second teacher, improved textbooks, and a functioning library of 40 volumes that she had personally sourced and purchased through a catalog from a bookshop in Dallas. Ezekiel was proud of her in a way that was entirely uncomplicated. He said so often, and she told him he was biased, and he agreed readily and told her it was also true. Thomas was 7 by then, and George was 5, and Clara was 3, a child of startling determination who had her mother's direct gaze and her father's dark hair, and who had, at age 2.5, dismantled the latch on the chicken coop and let 6 hens into the kitchen and stood in the resulting chaos with an expression of complete satisfaction. The children grew up knowing the story of the letter. Not all at once and not as a formal lesson, but in the way children absorb the significant things about their family, gradually and through repetition, and through seeing how the adults around them lived in relation to it. Thomas was the most interested, asking precise and intelligent questions about the legal aspects of the land transfer that made Ezekiel feel occasionally outpaced. George was more interested in the abstract moral dimensions, approaching it with the kind of earnest seriousness that made Bessie both amused and deeply moved. Clara said, at age 7, that she thought the most important part was that the letter had been written at all, because if it had not been written there would have been nothing to find, which was a more sophisticated observation than most adults would have offered. The ranch continued to grow through the late 1880s, benefiting from the improving rail access and the generally prosperous cattle market of those years. By 1888, the Bishop operation was one of the three largest in Coldwater Creek County, running close to 400 head across the combined acreage that had once been both the homestead and the Double Cross. The original homestead house had been expanded twice and was now a proper farmhouse with a full kitchen garden, a wash house, a smokehouse, a large barn, and 4 hands' quarters built along the western fence line. The name Bishop in Coldwater Creek County had come to mean something very specific: a fair dealer, a straight shooter, a man whose word held and whose accounts were honest. It was a meaning that had nothing to do with Thomas Harlan and everything to do with the 26-year-old telegraph operator who had ridden in off the stage and found a letter under a hearthstone and decided that the name was going to mean something different going forward. Bessie had said that years ago on the porch, and she had been right, as she was right about most things that mattered. There was an evening in the autumn of 1888 when they rode together over the southern pasture at sunset, just the two of them, something they still made a point of doing when they could manage it, the wide Texas sky going amber and rose above the long grass, and the cattle moving slowly in the distance, and the smell of sage and horses and clean air filling the world around them. They rode without talking for a while, and then Bessie said, without preamble, in the way she always said the things that had been building in her, "I was thinking today about the letter." "What about it?" he said. "About what would have happened if you had not found it," she said. "If the stone had stayed put, if you had just built what you built without knowing." He had thought about this too over the years. Caswell would have died not knowing, he said. The Bishop operation would have been built on land we had no right to. The ranch we have now would be different, she said. Not just legally, something about the foundation of it. "Yes," he said, "something about the foundation." She was quiet for a moment, the horse moving easy beneath her. "I am glad you found it," she said. "Not just for Caswell, for you, for what you chose to do with it." She paused. "For what we built from that choice." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand for a moment, her capable, work-roughened hand that had shaped everything he considered most important in his life. "Bessie," he said. "What?" "I love you," he said. It was not the first time he had said it, not by a considerable margin, but some things were worth saying as often as the moment called for them. She turned to look at him, and her expression in the last of the sunset was the one he loved best, that combination of warmth and steadiness that was entirely her own, the look of a woman who had never needed to be rescued but who had chosen, freely and with full knowledge, to build something with him. "I know," she said. "I love you too." She squeezed his hand once and released it and looked back out over the plain. "Now let us make sure the south fence line is properly mended before the temperature drops." He laughed, the large outdoor laugh that the plains had taught him, that he had not possessed in Fort Worth, and she smiled ahead into the sunset, and they rode on together across the long golden grass of the land that he had chosen to earn honestly, and that was, as it had always been, exactly enough. The years that followed wrapped themselves around the Bishop Ranch with the particular rhythm of a life that has found its true shape. Not easy, not without trouble, but steady and real and made of the right things. Ben retired in the winter of 1889, his knees finally refusing the demands of the saddle, and Ezekiel built him a small, comfortable room at the back of the main house, where he lived for the remainder of his years, watching the children grow with the affectionate proprietary pleasure of a man who had watched the whole thing take shape from the beginning. Dale eventually moved on to his own small operation 10 miles north, and they remained good neighbors and occasional partners for many years. The school that Bessie had shepherded and expanded became the finest in the county, eventually growing to 3 teachers and serving not only Coldwater Creek, but the surrounding ranches and homesteads. And the library she had started with 40 volumes grew to more than 200 by 1890. Housed in a dedicated room added to the school building that bore a small wooden plaque above the door reading Ellsworth Room, which she had not requested, and which made her, when she first saw it, stand very still in the doorway for a moment with her hand over her mouth. "They should not have done that," she said when she came home that evening. "Why not?" Ezekiel said. "My name is Bishop now," she said. "It says Ellsworth because that is the name you were carrying when you did the work," he said. "I think that is correct." She considered this for a moment. "All right," she said. "That is correct." Thomas grew into a young man of 19 by 1898, serious and capable, with a gift for the business aspects of ranching that exceeded even his mother's considerable aptitude for numbers. He had his father's long frame and his mother's precise manner of speech, and he had read every book in the Ellsworth room at the school, and then had read the ones on the shelves at home, and was beginning to feel the particular restlessness of a young person whose mind is larger than their immediate surroundings. Ezekiel recognized the restlessness, having once had it himself, and he sat with Thomas on the porch one evening and said, "If you want to go east for schooling, the ranch will still be here when you come back. You have built enough of this operation to have a stake in it whether you leave or not." Thomas looked at him with that careful, measuring gaze that was so much his mother's. "And if I come back with different ideas?" "Then we will have a vigorous discussion," Ezekiel said, "and your mother will make the final call." Thomas almost smiled, which for Thomas was equivalent to a full laugh. "That is how it works, is it?" "That is absolutely how it works," Ezekiel said. "Write it down so you remember." Thomas did go east, to study at a college in Austin, and he came back 2 years later with ideas that were different, and vigorous discussions were indeed had, and Bessie did indeed make several of the final calls, and the ranch was better for it. He brought with him, on his return, a young woman named Alice from San Antonio, a schoolteacher's daughter with an excellent mind and a quiet humor that won Bessie over in approximately the first 10 minutes of conversation and Ezekiel in the first 3. And Thomas married her in the spring of 1900 in the Coldwater Creek church, which had long since been repainted and was no longer peeling. George went in a different direction, developing his natural aptitude for mechanical things into a skill with engines and machinery that the incoming century was going to need very much. He apprenticed with a machinist in Abilene, and then set up a repair shop in Coldwater Creek that became essential to the farming community within its first year of operation, and which he ran with the cheerful, relentless energy that had been his defining quality since infancy. Clara, at 15, was already clearly the most formidable of the 3, a combination of her father's moral seriousness and her mother's practical intelligence, deployed with a degree of confidence that occasionally startled people who did not know the family. She would in time become a teacher herself, and then eventually a principal, and then eventually the kind of woman whose influence on a community is felt for generations in ways that cannot always be traced back to their source. But that was ahead of them. In the autumn of 1900, Ezekiel was 48 years old and Bessie was 45, and on a clear October morning he found her standing in the main room of the house looking at the fireplace he had built himself from creek stones in the spring of 1878, and she was looking at it with a particular thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking?" he said, coming to stand beside her. "I was thinking about the stone," she said. "The hearthstone, the one you pried up." He looked at the fireplace. He had replaced the original stone with a new one after finding the letter, a flat limestone piece he had gathered from the creek bed himself, and it sat flush and solid at the base of the hearth, immovable. "It was a long time ago," he said. 22 years, she said, "and everything we have is because of what was in it, and everything we have is also because of what you chose to do when you found it." She paused. "I was thinking that the stone should have something on it. Something so that whoever stands here after us knows what the house is built on." He thought about this. "What would you put on it?" She considered for a long moment. "The truth," she said, "just the word. Because that is what it is, really." He had the stone engraved by the stonemason in Coldwater Creek the following week, a single word carved into the face of the hearthstone in clean, plain letters: truth. And they laid it back into its place at the base of the hearth, and it was the first thing you saw when you came into the main room of the Bishop house on the Double Cross Ranch, and it stayed there for as long as the house stood. On the evening after the stone was set, they sat together on the porch as they had done 1,000 evenings before, in the chairs that had been replaced twice over the years, in the spot that had the best view of the western plain. The October light was doing what October light in Texas does, turning everything to copper and amber and a shade of rose that had no name in English. And the air was cool and clear and smelled of the end of the grazing season and the beginning of the long quiet. Bessie's dark red hair had silver in it now, more silver than red perhaps, and she wore it loosely pinned in the evenings the way she always had. And she was as beautiful to him as she had been on the morning he had first seen her drive up to the Double Cross in her canvas work apron with the piebald mare, beautiful in that specific way of people whose faces have been shaped by their character over time, which is a better and more lasting beauty than youth. He reached over and took her hand, as he had done so many evenings on this porch. She turned to him, and in her expression was every version of her he had known. The efficient, cautious woman who had come to assess the new owner of the Double Cross and decide whether to keep her employment. The woman who had sat across the table reading his grandfather's letter and not flinched from what it required. The woman who had stood in the frame of the new house and said yes to him in the doorway with the spring light around her. The woman who had held their son for the first time with all her careful practicality set completely aside. The woman who had ridden beside him over these plains for 22 years, making this life with him, with every bit of her considerable intelligence and capability and love. "Well," she said, with the small, warm, quiet smile that was entirely hers, "it has been something, has it not?" He looked out at the plains, at the long grass and the far sky and the cattle moving in the southern pasture and the smoke beginning to rise from the cook fire where Roberto was starting supper. And at all of it, the whole honest, hard-won, abundantly alive thing that they had made together from a letter under a stone and a name that had needed to earn its meaning. "It has been something," he agreed. He brought her hand to his lips and held it there for a moment, the October sky burning above the plain, the Bishop Ranch settled and quiet and good all the way to its foundation. And Bessie Ellsworth Bishop, who had always paid attention, leaned her head against his shoulder and let the evening come.